You cannot heal your arthritis pain if you still eat these 5 fruits. There is something most people never question when it comes to arthritis pain: the belief that all fruits are automatically healing, safe, and supportive. But what if that idea is only half the truth, and the real story is far more complicated inside the body? Because certain fruits do not behave the same way in an inflamed system. They can quietly shift sugar levels, nerve sensitivity, and internal inflammation without giving any immediate warning. It does not feel dangerous at first. It feels normal, even healthy, until pain starts becoming more unpredictable, more reactive, and harder to control. In this video, you are going to see 5 common fruits that may look harmless on the outside, but inside the body they can influence arthritis in ways most people completely overlook. And once you understand this, your approach to healthy eating may never feel the same again. Let's start. 1. Fruit juices. When people hear fruit, they instantly imagine something safe, even healing, something that should calm the body instead of disturbing it. But fruit juices behave very differently, almost like a hidden switch that quietly changes inflammation levels without giving any early warning. The real shift begins not in the fruit itself, but in its transformation. Because once you remove the structure and turn it into liquid, something important disappears: the fiber, and what remains is a fast, concentrated sugar stream that enters the bloodstream with unusual speed. This sudden entry creates sharp glucose spikes, and those spikes activate inflammatory pathways that increase cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha. The same signals strongly linked with worsening joint stiffness and persistent pain patterns that feel harder to control over time. What makes fruit juice even more suspicious in arthritis conditions is its high fructose concentration, which is processed mainly in the liver, and this process can quietly increase uric acid production, a factor that can intensify inflammatory joint environments in sensitive individuals. Clinical discussions in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition have shown that frequent intake of fructose-rich beverages is associated with higher inflammatory markers and metabolic stress patterns, and that combination can slow down recovery in chronic joint conditions. It is not that fruit becomes harmful, but the liquid form removes all the natural checks that normally keep its effects balanced inside the body. Another hidden layer appears when you remove dietary fiber, because fiber is not just bulk, it is a biological regulator that slows sugar absorption and feeds gut bacteria responsible for producing anti-inflammatory compounds like short-chain fatty acids. Without this system, the gut environment gradually shifts toward a more inflammatory state, reducing the production of these protective molecules and allowing immune activity to become more reactive than necessary. Research in the Journal of Nutrition has consistently shown that high-fiber diets are linked with lower systemic inflammation, while low-fiber liquid sugar intake shows the opposite pattern, quietly increasing inflammatory load over time. Then there is the role of natural fruit acids, like citric and malic acid, which in whole fruit are balanced by fiber and chewing, but in juice become concentrated and rapidly absorbed. This can create a subtle metabolic stress response, especially in sensitive individuals, where the body reacts more strongly than expected. While these acids are not harmful in normal whole fruit consumption, their isolated liquid form increases exposure speed, which can influence discomfort during inflammatory flare-ups in a way that feels unpredictable and inconsistent. From a practical standpoint, fruit juice does not need to be completely eliminated, but it requires careful control. A safer range would be around 100 to 150 milliliters occasionally, not daily, especially for individuals dealing with active joint inflammation. In people with diabetes, metabolic syndrome, or elevated uric acid levels, even small amounts can create noticeable symptom changes if consumed regularly. It also becomes more problematic when taken on an empty stomach, because that is when sugar absorption is fastest and hormonal responses are strongest. One important precaution is to always prioritize whole fruits over juice, because the intact fiber structure slows digestion, stabilizes glucose release, and reduces inflammatory activation. If juice is consumed, it should ideally be freshly prepared, diluted with water, and paired with protein or healthy fats to slow absorption and reduce metabolic spikes. Packaged juices are even more concerning because they often contain added sugars and lack natural balancing compounds, making the inflammatory response stronger and more unpredictable. What makes this subject so important is the hidden nature of the effect, because most people believe they are making a healthy choice, while internally the body is dealing with repeated sugar surges that quietly amplify inflammatory signaling. Over time, this repeated pattern can make joint pain feel more sensitive, more reactive, and less stable, almost as if the body is constantly being pushed back into irritation, even without obvious triggers. So the real insight is not to fear fruit, but to understand the difference between whole fruit and fruit juice, because one works with the body's natural regulation systems, while the other bypasses them completely and delivers sugar in a way that can silently intensify inflammation. 2. Grapes. There is something quietly deceptive about grapes because they look light, refreshing, and almost medicinal in appearance. Yet inside the body, they behave very differently depending on how and how much they are consumed, and that difference can quietly influence inflammation in people dealing with arthritis pain. The main concern begins with their high natural sugar content, especially fructose and glucose, which are rapidly absorbed and can create short bursts of elevated blood sugar. These spikes are not harmless in chronic inflammatory conditions because they activate biochemical pathways that increase inflammatory mediators like IL-6 and TNF-alpha, both strongly associated with joint stiffness and pain sensitivity. What makes grapes more interesting and slightly suspicious in this context is that they also contain polyphenols, especially resveratrol, which is known for its antioxidant activity. On the surface, this sounds protective, and in small, controlled amounts it can be beneficial, but the balance is delicate. When sugar load is high, the potential anti-inflammatory effect of resveratrol can be overshadowed by metabolic stress caused by excess fructose metabolism in the liver. Clinical discussions in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition suggest that high intake of rapidly absorbed sugars is associated with increased systemic inflammation, especially in individuals with metabolic or joint-related conditions. And this creates a situation where even healthy compounds may not fully counteract the overall effect. Another layer to understand is how grapes influence uric acid metabolism, because fructose breakdown in the liver can increase purine degradation, leading to higher uric acid levels in some individuals. When elevated uric acid is not just a gout concern, it also contributes to a more inflammatory internal environment, which can worsen joint discomfort and stiffness over time. This is why certain people notice that symptoms feel more intense after consuming large portions of sweet fruits repeatedly, even though the fruit itself is natural. Grapes also contain natural acids and tannins, which in moderate amounts are harmless and even antioxidant in nature, but when consumed in excess, especially in large clusters or as juice, they can contribute to digestive fluctuations that indirectly influence inflammatory balance through gut microbiome changes. A stable gut environment is critical because gut bacteria regulate production of short-chain fatty acids that help reduce inflammation. Acts and disruptions in this balance can subtly increase immune reactivity. Research in the Journal of Nutrition highlights that dietary sugar overload can negatively shift gut microbial composition, increasing inflammatory signaling over time. At the same time, grapes do provide beneficial nutrients like vitamin C, vitamin K, and small amounts of potassium, which support antioxidant defense and fluid balance regulation. However, these benefits depend heavily on portion size, because the sugar load rises quickly with quantity. This is why grapes are not inherently harmful, but their impact becomes highly dependent on how they are consumed and in what amount. From a practical standpoint, a safe portion for most individuals would be around 10 to 15 grapes per serving, be preferably consumed with protein or healthy fats like nuts to slow sugar absorption and reduce glucose spikes. Eating large bowls or drinking grape juice regularly can increase inflammatory load, especially in people with active arthritis, insulin resistance, or uric acid sensitivity. It is also better to avoid consuming grapes late at night or on an empty stomach, because that is when sugar absorption tends to be faster and metabolic stress becomes more noticeable. One important precaution is to avoid treating grapes as a free snack that can be eaten endlessly, because their sweet taste often hides how quickly they influence blood sugar levels. Frozen grapes or paired combinations with yogurt or seeds can help reduce the speed of absorption and create a more balanced metabolic response. Packaged grape juices or dried grapes, raisins, require even more caution because both forms concentrate sugar further, increasing the inflammatory potential significantly. What makes grapes particularly interesting in the context of arthritis is this internal contradiction because they contain antioxidants that support protection, yet also carry a sugar load that can quietly fuel inflammation when consumed excessively. Over time, this imbalance can make joint pain feel more reactive, where symptoms fluctuate depending on diet patterns rather than remaining stable. So the key insight is not that grapes are harmful, but that dose and form completely change their impact. And in arthritis conditions where inflammation is already sensitive, that difference becomes more noticeable than most people realize. 3. Pineapple. There is something almost misleading about pineapple because it looks like a natural anti-inflammatory fruit, something bright and tropical that people assume must always help the body, yet inside certain conditions, it can behave in a far more complex way, especially when arthritis pain is already active and sensitive. The key compound that creates this dual nature is bromelain, an enzyme mix that is widely studied for its ability to break down proteins and influence inflammatory pathways. At controlled levels, bromelain has been shown in clinical literature, including discussions in the Journal of Medicinal Food, to reduce swelling by modulating inflammatory mediators, but the effect depends heavily on dose, timing, and overall dietary context. What makes pineapple interesting and slightly suspicious in this discussion is that while bromelain may help reduce inflammation, the fruit also carries a significant load of natural organic acids, especially citric acid and malic acid, which can stimulate sensory nerve endings and increase sensitivity in already inflamed tissues. In people with active joint irritation, this heightened sensitivity does not cause damage directly, but it can amplify the perception of discomfort, making pain feel sharper or more reactive after consumption. This is not commonly discussed, but it becomes noticeable in individuals who are already in an inflammatory state where nerve signaling is easily triggered. Another important factor is the glycemic impact of pineapple, which is higher than many people expect. Even though it is a natural fruit, it contains rapidly absorbable sugars like fructose and glucose, which can lead to quick rises in blood sugar levels. These spikes are important because they can activate metabolic stress pathways that increase oxidative stress markers, which in turn influence inflammatory signaling inside the body. Research referenced in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has shown that frequent intake of high glycemic foods can increase inflammatory load, especially in individuals with metabolic sensitivity, which often overlaps with chronic joint conditions. Pineapple also contains histamine-releasing compounds, which in some individuals can increase sensitivity responses in the body. This does not mean pineapple causes allergy-like reactions in everyone, but in sensitive systems, histamine activity can contribute to a feeling of increased warmth, mild swelling, or discomfort in already inflamed areas. This subtle effect is often overlooked, but it adds another layer to why responses to pineapple can vary so widely between individuals dealing with joint issues. At the same time, pineapple does provide beneficial nutrients like vitamin C, manganese, and small amounts of antioxidants, which support collagen formation, enzymatic activity, and cellular protection. However, these benefits exist in balance with its sugar and acid content, meaning the overall effect depends strongly on portion size and individual tolerance. This is where misunderstanding happens, because people assume anti-inflammatory automatically means safe in any quantity, which is not always the case in active inflammatory conditions. From a practical perspective, a safe intake level is generally around 100 to 150 grams per serving, which is roughly a few small slices, and it is better consumed after meals rather than on an empty stomach to reduce acid impact and glucose spikes. Consuming large portions, especially in juice form or as dried pineapple, can concentrate sugars and acids, increasing the likelihood of inflammatory sensitivity. People with gastritis, insulin resistance, or active arthritis flare-ups should be especially cautious with frequency. One important precaution is to avoid pairing pineapple with other high-sugar foods in the same meal, because combined glycemic load can intensify metabolic stress. It is also better to avoid consuming it late at night, when inflammatory regulation naturally slows down, making the body more reactive to dietary triggers. For some individuals, combining pineapple with protein or healthy fats can help stabilize absorption and reduce rapid blood sugar fluctuations. What makes pineapple particularly complex is this internal contradiction, because it contains compounds that can support anti-inflammatory activity on one side, while also carrying elements that can increase sensitivity and metabolic stress on the other. This means its effect is not fixed, but highly dependent on the internal condition of the body at the time of consumption, especially in people dealing with chronic joint inflammation. So the real understanding is not about avoiding pineapple completely, but recognizing that in arthritis conditions, timing, portion, and body sensitivity decide whether it feels helpful or aggravating. And that subtle difference is often what determines how stable or unpredictable pain feels over time. 4. Watermelon. There is something almost suspicious about watermelon because it looks like the most harmless fruit in existence. Light, cooling, full of water, something people eat freely without a second thought. Yet inside a sensitive body, it can create subtle internal shifts that most people never connect back to pain. The issue begins with how quickly it moves through the digestive system, because its high water content combined with natural sugars allows extremely fast gastric emptying, meaning it enters circulation sooner than expected, and that speed can quietly influence how stable inflammation feels in already reactive joints. One of the most overlooked elements is L-citrulline, an amino acid present in watermelon that converts into L-arginine and increases nitric oxide production. On paper, this sounds beneficial because it improves blood flow and vessel relaxation, but in an inflamed state, the story becomes more complex. Increased nitric oxide can heighten sensitivity in already irritated tissues, not by causing damage, but by changing nerve signaling intensity, which can make joints feel more reactive during flare-ups. This is why the same fruit can feel calming for one person and slightly aggravating for another depending on inflammation levels at that moment. Then comes the hidden metabolic angle, its relatively high glycemic load for a fruit that tastes watery and light. The natural sugars, mainly fructose and glucose, are absorbed quickly due to very low fiber content, leading to short but noticeable blood sugar fluctuations. These fluctuations can activate oxidative stress pathways, which are closely linked with inflammatory signaling in the body. Research discussions in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition highlight how repeated rapid glucose changes can increase inflammatory responsiveness, especially in individuals with chronic joint conditions where baseline inflammation is already elevated. Watermelon also contains lycopene, a strong antioxidant that usually supports reduction of oxidative damage, but here the effect depends heavily on balance. In a stable metabolic environment, lycopene helps neutralize free radicals, yet when combined with frequent sugar spikes, its protective capacity may not fully counteract the stress response triggered by glucose fluctuations. And this is where misunderstanding happens, because people assume antioxidants automatically cancel out all negative effects. But in reality, the overall dietary pattern determines the outcome, not a single compound in isolation. On the supportive side, watermelon provides potassium and magnesium, which help regulate fluid balance and muscle relaxation, and these can contribute to general comfort in joints and surrounding tissues. However, because watermelon is so easy to overconsume due to its refreshing nature, these benefits often get overshadowed by the metabolic effects of excess intake, especially when eaten in large bowls or repeatedly throughout the day. From a practical standpoint, a controlled intake of around 150 to 200 grams is considered reasonable, and it is better consumed during daytime rather than late night, because metabolic regulation is stronger earlier in the day. Eating it on an empty stomach can intensify absorption speed, which may increase sensitivity in people who already experience inflammatory flare-ups. Those with insulin resistance, unstable joint inflammation, or frequent pain fluctuations should be particularly cautious about portion size and frequency. One important precaution is to avoid treating watermelon as unlimited hydration, because its high water content creates a false sense of safety, leading to excessive intake without awareness of sugar load. Pairing it with protein or healthy fats like nuts can slow down absorption and reduce sudden glucose changes, making its effect more balanced and less reactive. What makes watermelon especially interesting in the context of arthritis is this hidden contradiction. Because it feels soothing externally, yet internally it can create rapid metabolic changes that influence how pain is perceived. That is why some individuals experience no issues at all, while others notice subtle increases in joint sensitivity depending on timing, quantity, and overall metabolic state. So the real insight is not about fear, but awareness, because in inflammatory conditions like arthritis, speed of absorption and metabolic response matter just as much as the food itself. And watermelon sits exactly in that quiet, unpredictable middle where small choices decide whether it feels calming or slightly aggravating over time. 5. Dried fruits. There is something quietly deceptive about dried fruits like raisins, dates, and dried mango, because they look healthy, natural, even traditional. Yet the drying process completely changes their internal chemistry in a way most people never realize when they are trying to manage arthritis pain. What appears as a simple snack is actually a concentrated source of fast energy, where water has been removed but natural sugars like fructose and glucose remain highly concentrated, creating a much stronger metabolic impact than fresh fruit. The first hidden concern begins with this sugar concentration effect, because when fruits are dried, their volume shrinks, but their sugar density increases several times. This means a small handful can deliver the same sugar load as a large portion of fresh fruit, but without the fiber structure that normally slows absorption. This rapid sugar entry into the bloodstream can trigger quick glucose spikes, which activate inflammatory pathways involving IL-6 and TNF-alpha, both strongly associated with increased joint sensitivity and stiffness. Clinical discussions in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition have highlighted how repeated high glycemic exposure can increase inflammatory reactivity in chronic conditions, especially where baseline inflammation already exists. Another layer that makes dried fruits more complex is their impact on insulin response and metabolic stress, because the liver processes these concentrated sugars rapidly, and in doing so, it can increase oxidative stress markers. This is important because oxidative stress directly influences how sensitive inflamed tissues feel, often making pain perception sharper even without structural changes in joints. Unlike fresh fruit, dried versions lack water content that normally slows digestion, which means the body receives a more immediate metabolic load. Then comes something less discussed, the role of advanced glycation end products, which can form more easily in high-sugar concentrated foods when combined with heat during drying. These compounds can interact with proteins in the body and contribute to low-grade inflammatory signaling over time. Research in the Journal of Nutrition suggests that higher dietary AGEs are associated with increased inflammatory markers, which can worsen chronic discomfort patterns in sensitive individuals. Each dried fruit behaves slightly differently, which is where things become more interesting. Raisins are extremely dense in natural sugars and can rapidly increase glucose levels when eaten in large amounts. While dates contain high fructose content along with sticky carbohydrate structures that are digested quickly, creating a strong energy surge followed by metabolic fluctuation. Dried mango adds an additional layer of concentrated sweetness with reduced water dilution, making its glycemic impact more noticeable in larger portions. Despite this, dried fruits do contain beneficial nutrients like potassium, small amounts of iron, and antioxidants, which support general health, but the balance shifts heavily when intake is not controlled. These benefits are often overshadowed when consumption is frequent or portion sizes are large, especially in individuals already dealing with inflammatory joint conditions. From a practical perspective, the safe intake for dried fruits should be limited to about 20 to 30 grams per day, which is roughly a small handful, and ideally consumed with protein or nuts to slow sugar absorption. Eating them alone, especially in large quantities or as evening snacks, can intensify blood sugar fluctuations and indirectly increase inflammatory sensitivity. People with diabetes, insulin resistance, or active arthritis flare-ups should be particularly careful with frequency rather than completely eliminating them. One important precaution is to avoid treating dried fruits as a healthy, unlimited snack because their natural origin creates a false sense of safety. It is also better to avoid packaged varieties with added sugar or syrups, as these further increase glycemic load and inflammatory potential. Hydrating properly when consuming dried fruits can also help reduce digestive stress, as their low water content can sometimes slow gut movement. What makes dried fruits especially interesting in the context of arthritis is this hidden transformation. Because what starts as a healing natural fruit becomes a concentrated energy source that behaves very differently inside the body. That is why some people tolerate them well in small amounts, while others notice increased stiffness or sensitivity when intake becomes frequent. What you just learned is not about fear, it is about awareness. Because the body reacts to food in ways that are often silent before they become obvious. If this helped you see arthritis and everyday fruits from a deeper angle, then stay connected, because there is much more hidden science behind what we eat and how it quietly shapes pain over time. If this brought value to you, take a second to like this video. It helps push this knowledge to people who still think food has no connection with their pain. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next, and share it with someone who is still struggling with joint discomfort and deserves to know this side of the truth.